Hello there, and welcome to House Call with Dr. Hayes. In this episode, we're going to be talking about licensure, right? And how to set yourself up well so that you can go out and get all of that experience and be on the fast track to getting your LCSW in 2 years flat. So that was my path. I entered into a clinical position right after grad school, right after receiving my MSW, and in 2 years flat was able to sit for the licensure exam, pass the first time, and move on in my career as an LCSW. So I'm going to be giving you a few tips on how you can do the same. So what we're not going to be talking about in this episode is test preparation, how to, study for the exam. We're not necessarily talking about exam, right? What we are going to be talking about are the things that happen in that 2-year period of time where you're accumulating hours that can go right for you or can go wrong for you, right? So there's a lot of things that happen leading up to you sitting for the exam that you need to be aware of, and make sure that you're positioning yourself well so that you can, as quickly as you can in those 104 weeks or 2 years, be able to sit for that exam. So let's talk about it. The two primary things that we're going to be talking about is hours and supervision. Hours and supervision. So before I even get started, let me just give a disclaimer that all of the information that I'm presenting to you is available on the BBS website. So I'd encourage you to go to the BBS website. There's FAQs, all of the forms that I'm going to be mentioning are found there. And so that's going to be your source, right? I'm giving you my experience and going through the process, but you are definitely going to want to consult the source, which is the BBS. So make sure that you have the most updated forms, the most updated requirements, and all of that, okay? So I don't want anybody saying, oh, well, Dr. Hayes said. No, you go to the BBS and you make sure that you are getting the information right from the source. So without further ado, let's just get started. So first, let's talk about hours. There are a lot of ways that you can get hours. There are some things that you might be doing that you think are accumulating hours that are not. So let's talk about hours. So here in this worksheet that's posted here gives you the breakdown for LCSW hour requirements. So you can see that there's several categories that you can receive hours in: clinical, non-clinical, and supervision hours. So the big thing to remember is you need to get a total of 3,000 hours. You cannot do that any sooner than, I believe it is 104 weeks, right? So 104 weeks, 3,000 hours. That means that you can't just decide, I'm working these 60-hour weeks, I'm just gonna get done sooner. No, they put an actual minimum time period for which you can actually go through the licensure process. So 3,000 hours. You see, the bulk of those hours are in clinical experience because, again, the LCSW is not like the credentialing of social workers, right? There are lots of social workers who live wonderful lives, have productive careers without an LCSW. It is not like the, stamp of approval for a social worker. It is, though, the thing that signifies that you have chosen to focus directly on helping people, often in a clinical counseling setting, right? So it does say to folks that I have some level of expertise and advanced experience in a clinical setting and that you want to practice in that setting, right? It doesn't mean that you are restricted to that for your entire career. After receiving my LCSW, I decided I was kind of tired of direct practice, so moved on to other things. But it does signify that you have chosen to focus on direct clinical practice, right? So bulk of those hours are going to be in clinical hours, and it tells you here exactly what that could look like. Diagnostic assessments, treatment, individual or group psychotherapy. It's pretty narrow. You can, however, count hours in non-clinical things, right? So advocacy, all of those maybe macro practice activities you're engaged in could count towards a maximum of 1,000 hours, Okay, so it's not all indirect practice. And then you also do count hours for supervision, which is absolutely required when you're going through the process of collecting hours towards licensure. Okay, total of 3,000. The other thing that you really need to understand early on is that all of this entire process is your responsibility and only your responsibility. It is not your supervisor's responsibility to make sure you're on track with hours. It's not your colleagues. It is all on you. And if you don't meet your goal of completing hours or sitting for licensure, there is nobody you can point a finger at but you, right? So turn that finger right at yourself. So it is your responsibility to keep track of hours, know how many hours you have. No one else is logging this but you. So here is a form that the BBS provides so that you can track your hours weekly. Now, if you have an MSW, you've gone through that field practicum experience, your field internship, this tracking log should look pretty familiar because you were required to do the same thing as an intern, right? That you weekly should be tracking how many hours you have and what categories they fall under. And every week when you sit with your supervisor should be getting a signature on that thing, verifying that you've completed those hours. This is your responsibility and you need to take it seriously. So I'm going to tell you, this is one of the important tips I want you to take away. I actually went back and found my binder. I had a binder like this thick of papers, right? 104 plus weeks of these forms right here that had how many hours I did in what different categories with my supervisor's signature on it every week. Now, one of the reasons why this is really important, you may have noticed in fields that social workers tend to work in, there tends to be some turnover, right? So if you just happen to show up at work one day and your supervisor has moved on and you're being told that, oh, now here's your other supervisor, right? And you haven't been getting this tracked and signed every week, guess what? You might as well just blow those hours to the wind. Right? Unless you can hunt down that old supervisor and they're kind enough to sign off on something retrospectively, you just wasted, weeks, months, maybe even years, right? By not keeping track of those hours and making sure they're getting signed. So this is a very important point. Track them. You can find the form on the BBS website. Make sure that you're taking advantage of that. So those are the two big things that I want to mention around hours. Knowing how you can accumulate hours in what categories, and knowing that you need to track them regularly. Keep your own copies of them and make sure that your supervisor, whoever that is at the time, is signing them. So that's hours. Now let's move on to the topic of supervision, right? This is another really, really critical piece that can make or break your path towards licensure, okay? So supervision, one, it is absolutely required. Okay, so for the 2+ years that you're going through this process as an associate social worker, you're a trainee, it is expected that you will be supervised by someone who's at the level you're trying to get at, right? Who is an LCSW or a profession like that, which I'll break down in just a second. Absolutely required. You cannot accumulate hours without being supervised. I'll pause for a second there. Right? So knowing that, if you know that licensure is really important for you, that really should play a role in your decision-making process when you're looking for a job. Does this employer have the ability to provide regular, consistent supervision from a person qualified to supervise me, right? You also want to take advantage of it, not just in the kind of legalistic way of I need this person to sign off on my hours, but that this is maybe one of your last structured opportunities to get some real guidance and development on how to become a licensed clinician, right? So that when you're meeting with them weekly, you're talking about your cases, you're talking about things you're struggling with, right? You're working through the process of all kinds of things. There were so many times in supervision, I remember as an associate, where I thought I was just coming in to problem solve about this client. Oh, I don't really know what intervention to use. I'm feeling kind of stuck. And then next thing I know, the conversation leads to a place where I'm like, I didn't even know I was experiencing, counter transfers. I didn't even know that was happening, right? But talking through the clinical process with someone who has more experience than you often will reveal things that are going to help you grow as a clinician, right? So it's really, really important. You want to take advantage of it for your own learning. You want to use the process to grow. You also want to make sure that your training hours count, right? So you need that supervisor. Okay, so here's a form that talks about the requirements for supervisors, the who actually counts as a supervisor. Now, this is something I think a lot of people don't realize and may take for granted, right? So if you are working for, a really established employer, maybe a county provider of mental health services, they tend to have this whole process locked down. They've done it for years and years and years. They have lots and lots of employees, many folks that can supervise you. They tend to have this process down. If you're working for maybe a smaller nonprofit or another kind of organization, they may be less familiar with all of the requirements for supervision. Regardless of where you're employed, you want to make sure you're familiar with what the requirements are, and know that the person supervising you is qualified to do so, right? You can't just pick up Joe Schmo and, Sally Jane over there and ask, hey, can you supervise my hours, without finding out if they are actually qualified to do so. So here's a breakdown. You can read it, but I'll just hit a couple highlights. You can be supervised, at least for a portion of your hours, from someone who is not a licensed clinical social worker, right? So that is actually an option. You got to be careful, though, because there's a limit to that. So the limit is, I'm trying to read the note here without any glasses. You must have at least 1,700 hours from a licensed clinical social worker, right? 1,700 hours. But you have a total of 3,000 to accumulate. So that means that there are a good number of hours. I don't like math, so use the math real quick, right? On how many hours you can accumulate, supervise under someone in one of these other categories. A licensed professional clinical counselor, an MFT, even a medical doctor. I didn't realize that was an option until, going through this information. But you need to be sure that you're keeping track of your hours and that at least 1,700 of those are supervised by an LCSW. Okay? There's a couple of other criteria for someone to be eligible to supervise you, right? So not only do they have to be licensed, they have to have so much experience under their belt, they have to have supervised other folks before, they have to have done so many training hours in supervising, right? So your supervisor, if they're going to supervise your clinical hours, has to have taken 15 hours of a supervision course, right? So you got to make sure that you're talking to that person like, hey, very professionally, but hey, I just want to be sure that you feel comfortable supervising me and that you feel confident that you meet all the criteria laid out by the BBS, right? You want to make sure you have that conversation, because it could turn out that person's licensed, but they haven't done those 15 hours of training, so they're ineligible to supervise you, okay? So all things that you just want to note, questions you want to ask when you're moving into a position, when you're getting a new supervisor, to make sure that they're qualified to supervise you. Here's something else that you need to initiate. You need to initiate this kind of a statement plan on who your supervisor is going to be. Make sure that that's documented. Make sure that you have their actual licensure number. But you have to initiate this plan when you sit down with your supervisor, likely for the first time, and you're talking about the plan for your supervision, that this is one of the forms that you should have with you, right? Read over it. This is something that you can initiate a conversation with your supervisor around. The other thing that you want to be sure to initiate is this supervisory plan document here, right? So in this plan document, it really should feel familiar to the plans that you developed as an intern with your field instructor. The idea is, what are some of the things that you are going to work on? What is going to be your role? How will you accumulate hours? How will your supervisor support you in that? So although this is a form provided by the BBS, I really think it's a cool idea to use this as a tool to have a conversation that may not be completely comfortable for everyone, right? Not everyone feels very confident and bold to step in and say, hey, I want to talk about my supervision. Some of us are great at advocating for other people, but historically, social workers tend not to be not so great advocating for ourselves, right? So this at least gives you a hard tool to come in and have this conversation about what your supervision is going to look like. Make sure that your supervisor is committed to providing that weekly supervision. That is one of the prime things that can make your path to licensure go sideways, is being in an agency that won't regularly provide supervision, or working with a supervisor who won't commit to giving you that regular weekly supervision, right? So this gives you a document to, just have a conversation, make sure everybody is held accountable for you getting the supervision and the guidance that you're gonna need. Okay. So this last one here is something that I encourage folks to use. It's really a matter of your professional development and growth, and being sure that you're taking advantage of that hour that you have with this very, very busy person who's probably got more cases than you do and supervising all kinds of other people, to make sure that you're taking advantage of that. So this is a plan that you can complete prior to going into supervision that just gives you an opportunity to reflect on the week, some of the clients you're having challenges with, the questions that you want to ask that person, and you can just check off some boxes, make some notes, so that when you're coming into supervision, you're coming in with a couple of things. You're coming in with that weekly log, because you need that signature on your hours, and you're coming in with something like this that guides the conversation that you want to have with your supervisor on, here's some things I really need guidance on, here's some things that I'm struggling with, right? And you can come in with those things. Okay, so those are the basics of what I wanted to share in this first episode on licensure. Definitely not all encompassing of everything that involves licensure, but does cover some things that I think are fairly underrated or often missed, right? So understanding hours and what that looks like for you, and also making sure that you understand supervision. I think that might guide your process of job searching or thinking about your career and what employment might be best for you if you really want to pursue licensure. So thank you for joining me for this episode of House Call with Dr. Hayes.